Good morning, good afternoon. Did you want me to get started?
Yep, you can go ahead and start.
All right. Hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Melanie Cutlan. I am out in Denver, Colorado, actually, and I come in part of Accenture's blockchain and multi-party systems team. I co-lead the business together with David Treat. I'm excited to have with me here today, Rich Meszaros, who has a varied background with incredible experience across multiple industries and is our North America market lead. Rich, you want to say good morning?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rich Meszaros, and glad to be with you all today. As Melanie mentioned, I'm the North America market lead. I've been working in the blockchain space for about six to 7 years, actually just about 7 years already. And one of the key areas of interest that I really focus on is I really love the intersection of IoT and blockchain and commerce. That's what really got me into blockchain to begin with, is the intersection of those technologies and the new capabilities and experiences and products and services and revenue models that we can create from that. And I am based in Dallas-Fort Worth.
All right. We're excited to have you here, so feel free to say hello in the chat, and excited to see where you're all coming from. I see a few pings already, so keep the conversation lively, and Rich and I will play back and forth so we can keep you interested in this topic. But as we think about the topic today of blockchain consortiums and why people matter more than technology, and really kind of building out consortiums, we have a packed agenda. Just a couple of slides, but I think more about stories and what we can share in our experience in working with hundreds of clients in the multi-party system space and what we're seeing to transform. My background comes from a place of supply chain. I think I've worked in every industry and every back office function across the globe in my 21 years at Accenture. So excited to be here. So as we kick this off, one thing that is always, if you can go ahead to the next one, Rich, is and I tweet about this every year, is I look forward to our tech vision and our tech trends every single year, because what I think it does is shows, overall what new technologies are coming, what's really the conversation in the C-suite, and where that agenda is going forward. I was honored, along with David Treat last year, to actually help build out this part and be interviewed for the From Me to We, a multi-party systems path through the chaos. And what that means is really, our trends in the last few years have been building upon each other, right? That every business is a digital business, and how these trends have been going. What we saw in 2020 was such an unprecedented set of change. We've learned that we need to stack strategically, architect for that better future, to respond to the events in speed and at pace. That we are expecting a digital mirrored world, the digital twins, the intelligence that we see in our digital capabilities are in the forefront. This is no longer a labs-based R&D type capability. This is across the world, and this all matters, I think, in our multi-party system space. Everyone is a technologist, and we bring our technology anywhere and everywhere, and bringing our own environment and the work that we did to move work to remote locations, people working from home, and how that has changed and engaged with businesses around the world. And it really then culminates from me to we, is how do we look at us together as an ecosystem? It's not just solving for one business, but we saw more than ever before the need for us to collaborate together, right? As we went into stores and saw empty shelves, we realized that our supply chain partners were just as important as any core piece of our business. We've seen a just drive in multi-party systems to create new capabilities and new services across the board. So we like to call it multi-party systems. If you picked up on that, it's more than just blockchain as a suite of technologies where companies are, it's really about the business transformation and how companies are coming together across their ecosystem to really drive transformation and change. So you can go to the next one. And so you can read more about our Tech Vision at any time in the trends, just Google Accenture Tech Vision, you'll see. But part of the, and it's all backed by research. Part of that was that without an ecosystem strategy, businesses realize that they don't realize their full potential. And that is, I think, what is important. It's not just about having your digital strategy and your investment, but that it is about an ecosystem strategy. So many of you are pioneers in a new space, whether you're coming in as a developer or a business leader who's thinking about how to bring a product and a service to market. You're not alone anymore in thinking about how do we share data and information in new ways so that we can all get to the goal of transparency and data collaboratives around, right? I see what you see across the board. And so this is no longer something just sitting in the innovation space. We are seeing it front and center, and it's business and strategy led with technology that we assume needs to work. Right? The technology needs to work to realize the full potential. But what we're going to talk about today is some of what we've seen that helps that technology take off and be successful, and what doesn't work. So Rich, I'll hand it over to you.
And let me build off that last comment that you made, what doesn't work. So as Melanie mentioned, based on research and the work that we're doing with clients over the last several years in this space, there's been some key learnings around what are some of the key roadblocks, that really affect consortium success and productivity. And I wanted to talk through a bit of those and provide some additional context as to what these are all about. The first is, and this may seem obvious, but it's oftentimes very challenging, there has to be a common purpose. As you bring these ecosystems together, these multi-party system ecosystems together, although the stated objective may be similar, there's always a bit of nuance. And so ultimately that can make it very challenging to craft a common mission, to be able to identify and prioritize the value pools and the use cases that will unlock those value pools, and ultimately to get to a shared executional roadmap. And so that common purpose is such a critical component of that business strategy that Melanie mentioned. The second area here is around competitive conditioning. And this is really actually an interesting element here. If you think about it, as business professionals, we're always conditioned to create unique points of differentiation in the market. That's how we compete. And we want to be able to make sure that those unique points of differentiation create a sustainable competitive advantage for our companies, right? That mindset can make it challenging to allow parties to collaborate. And so I think it's important to kind of recognize that on going into the process, and as you're defining that common purpose, defining something that is really truly shared by all the parties that are working together here. The third area here, and Melanie mentioned it a moment ago, and I want to build on it again, is too often consortiums are so focused on the technology versus the collaboration. The technology is only one part of the consortium, and it's the part that really needs to be able to support the collaboration that is being defined, what it is that you're seeking to do. And so it's important that we think about the collaborative business model first, and then how the technology helps us to enable that. Another area that often can be challenging for consortiums is really thinking about how an individual party might gain utility or value at the expense of another party. So we call this, zero-sum game. This can ultimately be very toxic even to the collaboration across the entire group. So it's truly important to make sure that as we're defining the value pools and prioritizing the value pools, that we understand the impact of those value pools across the entire ecosystem, and that we are focusing on unlocking value for all. The fifth element here that I think is also important is ensuring that you have the right stakeholders at the table. This is obviously within your own organization, thinking about what it is you're trying to do and the different areas that you need to bring to the table to be able to do it, but also to think about who are the parties within the ecosystem that you want to bring into the table to really form that minimum viable ecosystem to get started. And then where do you go next? What's the strategy after that in terms of being able to bring in the next layer of partners as well? And then lastly, and I'm just going to put a plug out for all of our legal colleagues that support all of our businesses. It's really important to engage them early on in the process. I think they can provide a tremendous amount of value especially in that strategy formation phase of being able to provide a regulatory review to understand some of the hurdles that we may face, so that we identify those early, and so that we can develop plans to work through them. I think this is also where you can do an antitrust review to ensure that you have those, you are appropriately managing those conditions. But I think the other element to think about here is if you bring legal counsel for the parties that are coming together for the consortium. So each party might bring their own legal counsel or be supporting their business line together. You may also need legal counsel for the consortium itself, because they can look after kind of the group vision of what it is that you're trying to achieve versus the individual perspective of any one member in that consortium. Melanie, why don't we move to the next slide here, and I'm going to pass it back to you, and we'll talk a little bit about development of multi-party systems.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Rich. Yeah, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. My favorite of those is the zero-sum game of realizing if you succeed, you're actually taking value out of your other participants. And we try to help our clients, see that early and often, so that they don't get into something that doesn't succeed. But we've, after looking at many consortiums and in the different models in which they engage, there starts to be trends, right? And what we want to share with you is just kind of two simple visuals around these trends throughout this time today. And it's, first, clients start with, I identify that we have a common problem across an ecosystem, right? So it's across your value chain, across an industry, and wherever you're kind of making that play. We have a common problem. We assess the landscape, we identify and evaluate what opportunities, there's lots of business case development, prototyping, and things that happen. And then convene happens, right? So we all determine and confirm that we would benefit from a common solution. And so we've done the math, we've figured out that it's not a zero-sum game, that there's a real value to be had in this. And so figuring out what is that minimum viable ecosystem of participants that we can really get shared value across and motivations from collaborating. So I imagine many of you, if you've been in the blockchain space for any amount of time, as we have already seen, you're probably convening something today. And I think that's where most of the energy and time is spent, right? That's when you're building your product, you're building out your business case, you're making your business case come to life and onboarding and enabling products and customers. The last one I think is because of where we are in the evolution of this technology. I haven't seen a ton get to this thrive space, and I don't think it gets enough attention, right? When we not just build something, we convene it, but we create a thriving ecosystem that needs to be built, operated, and grow across this, and we start to then add more members, others will benefit from the solution. I see a lot of near-term investments of getting you to launch. It's like taking a startup and saying, I got all this angel investment funding so I can do day one, and then I have no customer support, no help desk. I didn't think about the next release that I want to do. How do I get to that next value of pool of customers that I want to approach, right? I have spent probably the last 10, 12 years in the innovation space in all kinds of emerging technology areas. And if you study innovation, really what it takes, right? Things like the lean startup methodology and others, they all apply here. You're starting a business. We call them consortiums often in this space, or multi-party systems, but you're starting a business, and many people create a new co along with it, right? A new company that owns the IP that is driving this forward. But really, to create a thriving business, it takes more than getting started and starting to see that immediate value. Because often when you release a new product that's really going to transform anything, you'll have that double spend for a while. I can't shut off my old system before I can turn on my new system and truly just use it, right? So I'm double spending on some technology. If there's any reason to, abandon ship, it's at that moment when you feel like everything is about cost. And so creating a thriving ecosystem, really give thought to what is the use case that you're trying to achieve, and how are you going to create an ecosystem that's going to thrive beyond just the day one? How do you continue to unlock value for that? And what new customers will you do, right? Because when you're in founding mode, you're in a very different thought about than when you're 6 months, a year in, 2 years into a solution. And how do I find other things that help it grow and keep the press release going, right? Keep the attention in the market, and keep that value flowing through your ecosystem, so that it's not just a few early adopter transactions, but really takes hold and becomes a part of the fabric of what we do. And so there's a lot in the business world that's been focused on, on this before. I don't hear about it in this space for some reason. And I think it's just the evolution where we're still going through a lot of that momentum. We're seeing large, production deployments happening around the world in key industries. And I think we're moving into that phase where now it's about helping those ecosystems thrive. Rich, do you want to add on before we jump in? Or?
No, I completely agree with you, Melanie. I think the real opportunity here is how we think about these ecosystems will evolve over time. And I think the other element that's really important to think about in that thrive is creating, as part of the governance model, a really effective change management process. Because as we add more customers, as we add more partners, as we add more products and services, as the technology evolves, as the market evolves, there's going to be a need to be able to take that initial governance model and create, 1.1 or 1.2 or 2.0. And having that effective change management process, I think is a really critical component that is often overlooked. And that's needed so that these businesses really can flex with the market, flex with the priorities, and flex with the technologies. I mean, even if I'm a banker by heart, so if I can just bring an analogy from the financial services industry, Visa, MasterCard is a great example of a network, right? And for many, many years in its evolution, it was a consortium that was really member owned and member run. It wasn't until, I think it was 2008 when they did an IPO. But one of the most interesting elements about them is they're incredibly good at change management. And they understand, if you think about the core Visa transaction, you've got really 4 primary actors in that ecosystem. You've got banks that issue the cards, you've got merchants that accept the cards, you've got payment processors that move the money around, and you've got all of us as cardholders. And ultimately, any change is looked at with the rigor around what type of impact does it have across that entire ecosystem, and how do we deploy that so that there's no point that I walk into into a store or log on to a site or use my mobile device and my card doesn't work. And I think there's a learning there that as these businesses start to scale up, that we really have to make sure that we're putting the appropriate resources against change management.
Absolutely. If you want to click to the next one, just to continue to build on that, right? It's, building that collaborative ecosystem is more than, just about the technology. Like any new business, it needs a good strategy and structure that evolves over time, that ensures that you have an eye on value sitting in the middle, right? And it's all about unlocking value across your ecosystem. You wouldn't be spending time in the blockchain space, I think, just because it's a cool technology, unless you were finding a place to apply it to something that does unlock value for those participants. So starting with business strategy, I think what's really interesting is if you look at what has made industry-wide transformation across the board in the past, many of those industry-wide solutions have been not-for-profit, right? There's standards bodies. Like I always like to use the GS1 example. It's true kind of across the board, a VIN number in a car anywhere, right? Like there's our standards bodies exist so that, it's not about I'm going to drive the way in which we all interact with each other and seek, suck value out of you as I do so. It's about often, the industry comes together and funds something that creates a new standard and cares for those standards. So GS1 for UPC barcodes, right? I can scan a cereal box at any grocery store and still have it resolved that it's the same cereal box. And that has happened by many of the people in the food industry saying, if we help this, nonprofit entity exist, then our lives are easier in doing business with the upstream, downstream business partners that we need to be able to do business with. And so I think we've seen a lot of these starting to emerge, and Rich is going to chat about Moby here in a minute, which is fascinating, and some of their business strategies. We've also seen another deployment pattern where it's founder-led, and there's a central deployment leader who already owns the ecosystem. So if you take something like the Australian Stock Exchange, where they are, they're gutting and replacing their central architecture for systemically important infrastructure, right? It has to work. And they are in charge of seeing how that will work and how it will come to fruition, and participants then can participate with them and share data and information in ways they couldn't before. And then we're seeing the startup community. So 1, 2, 3, right? The just pure nonprofit, we're creating standards and existing so that all of you can share data better, kind of creating those guidelines. We are the founder in the middle, and we already are in a position to set the standards. And then the third is, as we see, I think a lot, especially in the Ethereum space, is in the startup community, where there are vendors becoming that solution provider that says, I'm going to use this technology to create a solution. I'm going to raise funds the old-fashioned way and really drive a solution out into the market and get adoption through those ways. And if you think about that, consortiums can take any of those patterns. Consortiums are really just the language of companies coming together to achieve a common goal. It's funny, a couple of years ago, Rich and I were putting a white paper together around it, and I think all of our legal folks defined consortium differently. I feel like lawyers have defined definitions for everything, but consortiums are really just about coming together. And so are you coming together to share value, or are you coming together to extract value from the ecosystem? And I think if you look at those 3 deployment patterns, right, this truly just a standards body, I need to because I need my critical infrastructure to work, versus I'm a startup who's going to extract some value out of that ecosystem. There are plenty of scenarios in which there's enough value in the ecosystem that will be saved or achieved by the new tool that the startup can extract value out of that ecosystem, right? And that's not a zero-sum game. They're not taking from one to give to the other. And so I think if you think about just what your business strategy is, I would challenge you to think about them in those kind of different ways about because we've seen a ton of consortiums start over the years and not succeed because their competitors who needed to join for the solution to be successful, but they didn't want their competitor to make money off of their joining, right? And that's where this nonprofit kind of language started to come from. And so I think it's if you take that, thou shalt use my technology to do all cargo transit around the world or something, right? We see some kind of key first movers that have a lot of volume and they can make an influence in the industry, but then the rest of the industry quickly said, well, then we'll come together and do something different. And so we're still seeing that play out in the market in lots of different solutions around how 80% of the world's goods move through ships, but it's the pitfall we want you to make sure you think through and have a plan for in your strategy, is that as you drive value and achieve value, it's not just everyone takes pennies from the transaction and then left with no value left at the end of the day. Do you want to share a little bit, Rich, about what you're seeing with Moby and their strategy?
Yeah, absolutely, Melanie. And it's a great setup, your comments, because they're kind of in this transition where they've started out as standards and now they're trying to create infrastructure that can actually create value for the entire ecosystem. So it's a great example of how these consortiums can evolve. So Moby stands for the Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative. It was started in 2018. one of the primary founders was Chris Ballinger, who was an ex-exec of Toyota Financial Services, and he was responsible for innovation. And if you look back into the 2016, 2017, time period, think about where the market was from a blockchain perspective. Lots of companies were doing kind of proof of concepts, within their R&D function or their innovation team, and really trying to understand how the technology worked, getting some experience with some of the leading protocols, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the interesting thing about when Chris started reaching out to some of his network, he found out that a lot of the other OEMs were doing things that were similar. And he really came to a realization around, why are we doing this individually? We should be doing this together. And that was really the seeding of Moby. So it formed in 2018. Accenture is actually a founding member of it. We've been a member ever since. And I think, where the original mission and the original mission of Moby is really around how can blockchain technologies, the broad set of blockchain technologies, and other emerging technologies change mobility, and ultimately making mobility more efficient, making it more affordable, reducing congestion and pollution, and improving safety. And so when they started, the first focus was on standards because there weren't any within the automotive sector around the use of blockchain. And so that was absolutely one of the first things they needed to do. And this, I think, is really important because if a standard doesn't exist, then you might have one OEM that does something differently than another OEM. Back to my initial comment around, how do I create unique differentiation in the market? And if you don't have that standard, it can actually, I believe, stifle innovation, not only within the automotive sector, but with related industries in the automotive sector. So case in point, if Shell wanted to create some type of an application to be able to connect a pump to the car to allow the value transfer for filling up my car to occur, would Shell really want to create an app that worked with Ford, but didn't work with BMW and didn't work with Honda? And so, that could actually stifle the innovation that we're trying to create and that network effect that we're trying to create. So Moby has started with standards. There's over 100 members of Moby at this point. We obviously have lots of OEMs and tier one suppliers, startups, integration and innovation partners, but even seeing, regulators starting to join too. So that ecosystem is kind of expanding as we think about how do we start to enable these standards into infrastructure products that we all can leverage? They actually are working on a number of different working groups that tackle different areas of innovation. So everything from vehicle ID, which was seen as the very first core standard that they had to get right. It's important to be able to define, how can we have a verifiable identity of that vehicle that can be managed and verified on a blockchain, because all of the use cases that we want to do after that really needs that core use case to enable it. Other use case areas they focused on is usage-based insurance, electronic vehicle grid integration, connected mobility data marketplaces, finance and securitization, and obviously supply chain. And I think what's really interesting here is over the last 3 years, they've issued, I think it's a total of 8 different standards at this point. And these standards, they result in everything from business white papers to business requirements and use cases to tech specs to even reference architectures. But what's interesting here is now there's a movement really led by the OEMs to actually put these standards in action. And that's really creating the first infrastructure layer for the automotive sector. And if you think back to my analogy a moment ago with Visa, I'm going to build on that for a second. Underneath Visa is a key element of plumbing called VisaNet. And VisaNet connects the key players in the ecosystem, the banks, the payment processors, the merchants, to be able to exchange the data that needs to be exchanged, to run an authorization, to be able to close out my transactions for the day, and ultimately influences the settlement that occurs through the banking system. That infrastructure, that plumbing is called VisaNet. And what Moby is now trying to do is to take these standards to be able to build that type of infrastructure data layer using a shared data construct that allows us to now start to build use cases on top of it that creates these unique new products and services that are in the market. So I think it's an exciting development because it started out with standards that were needed. Now that they have standards, how do we put those into use? And ultimately, how can we enable the Moby community and ultimately others to be able to use that base infrastructure to be able to create new products, new services, new revenue streams in the market. And if you think about it, this should allow for, rapid deployment of these types of new products and new services through these the connections between the Moby community and others outside of the Moby community, because you have this infrastructure and these standards in place. So Melanie, back to you.
Yeah, I thought I jumped at, and that's always a fun example. I spent some time in the merchant acquiring business and building systems that allow you to authorize and settle. And it really is just kind of a wide web of networked transactions. And I think as we think about this in the blockchain space, operating model is also as important as your strategy. And so we, I think a number of years ago feels like forever ago now, wrote a white paper with the DTCC on governance specifically in that space. But we've spent, so in my varied career, I spent years in operations as well, and kind of back office operations, and how we run and support, the global 500s businesses. And knowing how governance works and how operating models are put in place is just as important, right? At the end of the day, any transaction needs a place to say, what do I do if something goes wrong? And depending on the criticality of your use case to your core business, right, there's a even more of a need to have an operating model in which it is clear, defined, and engaged with your customer and your membership base, right? And so if you think of now I'm losing my example, but I just had in my mind as my brain is competing which one to do. But as we think about an operating model, it comes from how do you govern the future roadmap? How do you take decisions? If you go back to a nonprofit entity versus a startup, right, or an existing large company, if I log a change request with Zoom or with Microsoft Teams or whatever tool I'm using, I know that change request is going to get in queue because I'm an individual user and it's going to wait for a long time. But if I'm Accenture, who might be one of Microsoft's largest install bases of Microsoft, we probably have a top-to-top conversation, and I'm not sure how this all works, right? But we probably have a top-to-top type of conversation of, hey, our business needs this new enhancement in order to kind of continue to drive, and there's some influence we have, right, in those decisions. And when business has been around for a long time, that is a tried and true path, right? Here's how you do normal change requests. Here's how you make major enhancement in requests to roadmaps, and companies typically share their roadmap of what they're going to do quarter by quarter, and they set dates for release plans and such, and there's an engagement model that's very much vendor to consumer. In many of these consortiums, because people are buying in, right, they're early investors often in these solutions, they have a different mindset around how should my request for a feature or function on a roadmap be taken into consideration, and how do I do that? And we see a lot of friction in that space. And I think it's just interesting on, are we really helping to define what that operating model looks like? How are decisions made about major things like roadmap and scope? Who is going to take the phone call when something goes wrong? In a multi-party system, support is different. Like, there's a support for the network, there's a support for the person on this side of the transaction and that side of the transaction. And how do you reconcile if it was started here, went there, and doesn't look the same on the other end, right? In design, they should all work. And I see a lot of people saying, well, it's blockchain, and so it's all the same on every side of the network, and it should always be correct, and we're just going to get rid of exceptions. And trust me, I was in an exception management business for a long time. This technology, there's a promise to get rid of exceptions, but between, I think there's always a reality of business changes, standards change, something changes in the industry, in which exceptions happen, and how are you to process them and work through them cleanly throughout that process. And then it goes to change management, as Rich said, right? Like pushing out a change to a centralized solution is great. We have downtime and an outage and we can be fine. If you are in a ecosystem industry-wide solution and the consortium decides to push an update and it's going to require some blips in coverage, that if we do it at a point in time in which it could be perceived as hurting a competitor, right, that's all kinds of problems. So building a strong operating model includes, right, a functional steering committee, a technical steering committee, as well as a kind of overall governing board, right? A board of directors type of concept. So that you really drive, effective collaboration and such across the board. So it can be quite in depth in different ways, or can be very light depending on what the need is and what the impact is if something should go wrong. And so happy to take questions specifically about any of these, because I think they're all highly complicated. But Rich, I know you've been a bit of the the founder on our governance models. Any more examples to add there?
Well, I mean, one thing I wanted, it's not an example, but just some of the comment that I wanted to make. I really wanted to talk a moment about the customer side here, because a lot of times that isn't necessarily the first and foremost as we think about some of these businesses. And I think it's really important to really think about, when we look at these technologies and the business value that we're trying to unlock, ultimately that should hopefully drive a different experience and value for that customer as well, right? Especially if it's some type of a consumer product. I keep coming back to the automotive aspect because one of my passions is to really think about the vehicle as a very sophisticated IoT device that connected with some of these technologies and connected to a broad set of ecosystem where you have this shared data construct that supports it. You can actually now start to understand the life of that vehicle across the entire the life of that vehicle across the entire life cycle, from design, engineering, all the way to end of life, but starting to enable new experiences and new products and new services. I often will say internally, I'd like to buy a green light, please. And I love saying that because I think that starts to become possible. And when I look at from the customer experience perspective, I think it's really important to have a very good understanding of the experience today and the friction today. And through the business value that you're trying to create in the market, what's the impact to the customer? And it's, the customer doesn't need to know that there's all these different types of technology that's used in the background. All they know is that the experience of their transaction improves. Some friction that they experience today goes away tomorrow. And I think that's a really important part of the process as you're defining your vision, your strategy, your priorities, is really thinking about what will drive that customer use. And ultimately, that starts to create, that has a brand impact for all of the organizations that are participating in that consortium.
Well said. I would encourage you guys, if you have any questions or specific topics you want us to touch more on, to add to the chat window in Zoom. We're happy to guide. Really, this is the content we have for today. So happy to guide the conversation in different examples. As we think about products and services, I guess maybe just a moment to hit on a different point. I'm not sure which use cases you guys are working on, or if you want to share that in the window. We've seen, really, along with Rich, I've been in this space since 2015, and we've seen three major priority themes in this space around the future of money, the future of supply chains, and the futures of identity. And each of those have a suite of use cases and products and services that different consortiums are coming together to drive and to really transform the way we think about a value chain, the way we think about end-tier supply chains, the way we think about objects and their their digital, not just their digital twin, but their digital thread, right? Where they go across the board, and how things have changed and its status has changed over time. The components of a whole, right? And being able to track that backwards and forwards are all use cases that we have seen as, you know, significant and important. And the identity of people, corporations, and things as well as the future of identity. And so, you know, the two of us have spent time kind of around the world looking at different use cases and different clients. So happy to answer any questions on that side. But it's, I think, really as you think about what your ecosystem needs, it has to be care and fed every step of the way. And your community matters, right? And so that community, and whatever that community looks like, is, I love, you know, embracing the open source space and how we think about this. And lots of good things. So sorry, I just noticed there was a question.
Yeah, what visionary inspires you the most in the space?
What, as an individual, or what visions, I guess? That's a good question. Individuals. Rich, did any come to mind for you?
Well, I'm going to put a shameless plug for Dave Treat, our global practice lead. It always amazes me when he starts talking about, you know, an industry, and the ability for him to be able to start to talk about where value can be led and where markets can be made. That he has inspired me for the last 6 years on his thinking about where, you know, industries can be transformed by this technology. I know that was a shameless plug, but
I mean, just to pile on that, right? As I open my, so we're going to share our Twitter and LinkedIn handles with you. Just had that open. The ability for, you know, the power of Accenture just amazes me on a regular basis, and all of our leaders in different industries and our access to clients, right? And the number of C-suites we get to talk to, every single one of them are absolutely amazing in whatever business they're leading. But the ability for us to convene an ecosystem together by making a few phone calls, right? And David Treat has recently been helping to shape congressional testimony. If you've seen the recent talk about central bank digital currency and what's happening with the digital dollar in the US and how currency is changing around the world, is absolutely spectacular. We've got, you know, people like Christine Leung who are shaping the future standards of identity and biometrics, and have been leading biometrics in the firm just for so long. John Belisarios, who's, you know, embedded in central banks around the world, and what's happening in some new and interesting ways. And people like Pooja Sanghvi, who's looking at supply chains, you know, in so many different ways. And like you said, we live in a world where we get to talk to so many different clients, and I don't want to name drop without all our permissions, but they are doing really interesting things, and where that meets, it just really brings me joy to my job to be able to help them think about what could you do if technology wasn't a barrier anymore, and how could you drive new value out of your ecosystem. Is quite a fun is a fun story kind of across the board, which is inspiring. I think some of the most inspiring use cases to me are those that really have a greater good story to it. We started off the morning, Rich and I did, and sharing with our practice, what's our why, right? And I think, you know, to me, my why in this space is because, you know, the future of money can help drive financial inclusion, right? The future of supply chains can help, you know, ensure supply of food around the world and reduce the trade finance gap, right? The $1.5 trillion in trade finance gap, which is just people who apply for financing and get denied. And it's going, the World Economic Forum expects it to go up over 2 trillion in the next couple of years, given everything that's happened with the pressures on supply chains and value chains and collecting funding. And, you know, if you think of the billion people in the world that are undocumented, right? If you think of refugee populations and others, there's so much we can do with this technology, that anything we can do in this space to help educate those who are looking to achieve their value. I think that's my why, and that's really the visions that excite me, is come across all that board. Good. Any other questions from the audience? Right. All right. Well, with that, I think I just leave you with thinking about what can you do to really drive the future of your industry, and how can you create an ecosystem that not only lets you identify the value pool, but convene together the right parties to drive success and to help that continue to thrive over time, right? You're not done day one on a launch, and how do you help that continue to thrive? Rich and I'll paste in here our LinkedIn and Twitter handles in the window here so you can follow us. We're always pushing out great content as we catch it and see it. I wish there was an easier way to always stay tuned in and plugged in, but we enjoy every day our chance to drive enterprise adoption of these technologies. So thank you for your time. And Rich, do you want to say a goodbye?
Yes, thank you, everyone. Appreciate you attending. Thanks for the great questions. And as Melanie said, please follow up if you have any additional questions. We're happy to do so.
All right. Thank you, Melanie and Rich, for joining us today. Please feel free to place your social media handles in the chat so all attendees can follow your work. For everyone else, you can follow the EEA on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. They've been pasted in the chat as well. For additional information about joining the EEA, please reach out to membership at eea-eth-alliance.org or visit eea-alliance.org/join. We welcome any and everyone to join and become a part of our global community. Thank you again, and this includes today's EEA Education Series webinar.
Thank you, everyone.